Welcome to Quick MCAT Lessons, where I try to explain MCAT topics in 10 minutes or less. Today we have the second half of our cardiovascular system practice questions, and we are starting on question 26. So due to kidney disease, what happens when albumin is lost in the urine? Well, this leads to decreased oncotic pressure because plasma proteins are important in generating oncotic pressure. This is done as they allow water displaced at the arterial end of a capillary bed by the hydrostatic pressure to be reabsorbed at the venule end. Number 27. The tricuspid valve prevents backflow from which chamber to which chamber? And the answer here is from the right ventricle to the right atrium. And remember lab rat, so right atrium tricuspid and left atrium bicuspid. Number 28. Which vascular structure contributes most to resistance in blood flow? Here you should be thinking arterioles. They are highly muscular and they have the ability to contract and dilate to affect blood pressure. Arterioles also result in the greatest drop in blood pressure in order for the pressure to be acceptable to the capillaries. Number 29. What is the difference between ischemia and hypoxia? So hypoxia is due to low oxygen levels and therefore wastes are adequately removed. Ischemia is due to reduced blood flow and so the waste builds up. Ischemia is considerably worse. Number 30. What would happen if the hypophyseal portal circulation was severed? Well, normally what happens is that the pituitary receives hormones directly from the hypothalamus, and if the portal system is severed, then hormones would have to take an alternate, longer route, and by the time they get to the pituitary, they would probably already be degraded and diluted. And this would result in major issues in pituitary secretion and regulation by the hypothalamus. Number 32. What is the order of valves in blood circulation? So this should be an easy one. Toilet paper my ass, also known as tricuspid, pulmonary, mitral, and aortic. Number 33. What would happen if the mitral valve ruptures? So the mitral valve is the valve between the left ventricle and the left atrium, and the left ventricle pumps to the aorta normally, and if the mitral valve were to rupture, then the left ventricle would be pumping blood to the aorta and the left atrium. Blood would be going backwards from the left ventricle to the left atrium, and this is actually called mitral valve regurgitation. It makes it so the heart can't pump enough blood to make the body's need. This would lead into fluid buildup in the lungs, and that is called pulmonary edema. Number 34. What valve separates the left and right ventricles? That was a trick question. No valve separates the left and right ventricles. They're separated by the septum, which is a thick muscular wall. Number 35. The ventricles are high pressure chambers, so why are the semilunar valves actually needed? And they're needed because the ventricles are only pressurized when contracting. When relaxing, they must have a very low pressure so blood can flow into them from the atria. The semilunar valves help maintain this. Number 36. How much blood is ejected from the ventricles during contraction, and what is this called? So about 2/3 of the blood is ejected, and this is called the ejection fraction. 1/3 of the blood actually remains in the ventricles. Number 37. Which is true during systole? So A, your bicuspid valve is open. B, the blood does not flow through the aortic valve. C, both your semilunar valves are closed. And D, the pressure in the atria is low and thus the atria fill with blood from the vena cava. So let's work through each answer step by step. So what happens during systole? Well, during systole, the ventricles contract and blood is pumped through the body. This means that your atrioventricular valves are closed and your semilunar valves are open. So A, the bicuspid valve is open. No, that's an atrioventricular valve. B, blood does not flow through the aortic valve. It does, because your semilunar valves are open and that's how it flows to the body. C, both semilunar valves are closed. Definitely not. And D, pressure in the atria is low and thus the atria fill with blood from the vena cava. Yes, this is true. Your atrioventricular valves are closed. This maintains the low pressure, and then when diastole, when the contraction is over, blood will trickle down into the ventricles. Moving on to question number 38. This is another calculation question. So an overweight child, an old man, and a female athlete all weigh 110 pounds. They all require a cardiac output of 5 liters per minute. But the child has a stroke volume of 1 over 16 liters, the old man has a stroke volume of 1 over 12 liters, and the athlete has a stroke volume of 1 over 9 liters. How hard does each of their hearts have to work? I hope you were able to solve that one. So when the question is asking how hard does each of their hearts have to work, this means they're asking for heart rate. And to calculate heart rate, this will be cardiac output divided by stroke volume. And so let's start with the child. The child's stroke volume is 1 over 16, and her cardiac output is 5 liters per minute. So it'd be 5 divided by 1 divided by 16. And if you rearrange it, this would essentially be 5 multiplied by 16. Divided by 1, of course. And so the child would have to go at 80 beats per minute. If we apply the same reasoning to the old man, this would be 12 times 5, so he would have to go 60 beats per minute, and the athlete, 9 times 5, would be 45 beats per minute. Question number 39. Does the right ventricle or left ventricle have a higher cardiac output? And the answer here is they have the same cardiac output. Question number 40. Why is the action potential delayed at the AV node? It's delayed because the atrium must contract during diastole to completely fill the ventricles with blood prior to systole. This delayed action potential allows for this complete filling to happen. Number 41. Why don't leak channels or potassium leak channels cause spontaneous action potentials in neurons or muscle cells? Potassium leak channels allow potassium to leave the cell down a gradient. This polarizes the membrane, and this is the opposite effect of sodium, as sodium is higher concentrations outside the cell and it is brought in, which depolarizes the membrane, causing the action potential. Number 42. Is the absolute refractory period during which a cell will not fire an action potential longer in cardiac or neuronal cells? So it is longer in cardiac cells as they have a longer action potential and will therefore have a longer absolute refractory period. Number 43. Will the strength of contraction by cardiac muscle be affected by extracellular concentration of calcium ions? Yes, it will. A significant portion of calcium that stimulates contraction comes from the extracellular pool entering as part of the action potential. Number 44. Does acetylcholine always inhibit postsynaptic cells? If not, how can different responses be elicited by the same neurotransmitter? Well, acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter, and it's released by all autonomic preganglionic neurons, all postsympathetic postganglionic neurons, and all somatic motor neurons. It is actually stimulatory in most cases, but whether a neurotransmitter is stimulatory or inhibitory actually depends on the nature of its receptor on the postsynaptic cell. Number 45. Why might tense, stressed out people tend to have a higher blood pressure? Well, tension and stress are similar to fear. This leads to the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which raises blood pressure. Number 46. Which of the following will increase cardiac output? A. Blocking sodium leak channels in the sinoatrial node. B. Stimulation of heart by parasympathetic nervous system. C. Significant dehydration due to prolonged exercise in the heat. And D. Contraction of smooth muscle in the walls of the large veins. So let's work through this. What is the question asking? Which will increase cardiac output? We know if cardiac output is increasing, then your heart rate will increase. And if you block sodium leak channels in the sinoatrial node, recall that sodium leak channels lead to an action potential. And so blocking these would lead to less action potentials, which would lead to a slower heart rate. So it can't be A. Now let's look at B. Stimulation of the heart by the parasympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic nervous system is rest and digest, so it can't be B. C. Significant dehydration due to prolonged exercise in the heat. Dehydration means loss of water, which will lower blood pressure. And so it must be D, and let's look at D. Contraction of smooth muscle in the walls of the large veins. Yeah, if you contract smooth muscles in your large veins, you will increase resistance and increase blood pressure and therefore increase cardiac output. Number 47. During exercise, a significant amount of lactic acid is produced by fermentation in muscles that are not receiving adequate oxygen. Does this cause blood pH to change? Why or why not? This does not cause blood pH to significantly change because the bicarbonate buffer system prevents pH changes like this. Number 48. Myoglobin is very similar to hemoglobin, but it has a single subunit with one binding site. Does myoglobin display cooperative binding? No, it does not, because cooperativity requires more than one subunit. 49. Decreased pH, increased levels of CO2 in the blood, and increased temp all reduce oxygen affinity of hemoglobin, and this is called the Bohr effect. What is the significance of this? Well, the Bohr effect is significant because it ensures oxygen delivery to the tissues that need it most. When doing strenuous exercise, it releases oxygen in those areas with higher carbon dioxide. When a tissue is activated, it metabolizes a lot of glucose, which leads to an elevated partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Soon after, the cell runs low on oxygen and performs a lactic acid fermentation, which leads to a drop in pH. Also, wherever there is high metabolic activity, there is increased temperature. All of these lead to a decreased affinity of oxygen, ensuring that those tissues actually get oxygen. Number 50. What would happen if capillaries throughout the circulatory system were made more permeable? Well, there would be a significant volume of fluid would be lost from the plasma into tissues. This would decrease volume and cardiac output, and this would probably result in circulatory shock. Number 51. Albumin is made in the liver. Alcoholics with diseased livers make insufficient albumin and in turn have insufficient plasma oncotic pressure. What happens due to this? Well, there will be edema in the entire body. This includes the limbs, abdomen, and lungs. The oncotic pressure is what facilitates reabsorption of fluid, and if you have insufficient plasma oncotic pressure, you're going to have a lot of edema. And the last question, number 52. At any given partial pressure of oxygen, which has a higher percent saturation, tense or relaxed hemoglobin? And it would be relaxed hemoglobin, as it has a higher affinity for oxygen. That's it for today. I hope these practice questions were helpful to you. Next time we'll be starting Psych Soc and we'll be starting 6A.